while ago I decided to make some dovetail joints with a handsaw. It didn't go very well and I kind of gave up on the idea to do it. I think that this works, but it's obviously got a lot of slop to it. But in the last month, I needed a dovetail as an example for a project. I decided if I was going to make a dovetail, I would go with my bandsaw. It's obviously easy to use the bandsaw to make those cuts. When I started looking up how to make pins with the bandsaw, then I realized that my bandsaw could not handle making the angles it needed to make. It could make one angle just fine, but rotating it the opposite way would not give me that cut I needed to complete the dovetail pin. So I came up with this jig. It allows me to cut it one way and then flip it to cut the other side of that pin. But then while I was making this, I thought, why not add a tail jig to finish it off? And that's how I came up with this combination right here. I also needed to be able to make the marks, so I made a little jig to do that with some little notches on the top that will allow me to space the edges. In the end of this video, I was able to make a box. This is the first time I've ever done anything with the bandsaw, and the joints aren't too bad. I think that this would work really well if I needed to make some drawers. And then I decided to kick it up a notch by making some really fancy dovetails. So today I'm going to show you how I made the jigs, how I made the marking gauge, as well as how to do each thing step by step to create some really nice dovetails. To make this, I only need 2 pieces of wood altogether. My first piece is 2 inches wide, and this piece is going to sit on the top, and it's 2.5 inches in length. It doesn't need to be very thick. This is probably maybe 3/8, maybe a little over 1/4 inch. My second piece is going to be glued to this piece, and this is going to be where my angles are. It's about 2.25 inches wide altogether, and the length of it is about 12 inches. And I want this long because I will be cutting this with the table saw. It's not absolutely necessary to have a square angle protractor, but after you cut your piece, you want to make sure that it's at 81 degrees. I've got a couple different miter gauges here for my table saw. I've already set this one with 81 degrees. This is the one that came with my table saw. This one is one that I bought extra, and you can see these positive stops here, which makes it more difficult. So you want to make sure that you get on that 81 degrees, which is why I recommend having one of these protractors. I'll take my square protractor, and if I line this up, again, I've set this at 81 degrees. If I line this up, I'm at 81 degrees. With this side cut, I'm going to flip it over like this, and I need to make a cut going this way. Before I do that, I want to attach my piece because I want it to be flush with the edge. It's really important that that is flush. We want to have a straight edge across here that joins up with that corner. In order to do that, I'm going to use a little super glue and wood glue to attach it. I am going to use the top of my table. I don't like the idea of doing that, but it's only going to be temporary. I'm going to hold it for 30 seconds and then take it away and then wipe it off. If you're going to do this, make sure that you're using the Loctite super glue, which is, I guess, their professional liquid. This stuff only takes 30 seconds with no activator to work. But I'll go ahead and line this up now. Again, it's got to be right on the edge. I'll give it 20 or 30 seconds. Got a little bit of glue on the top. So now that I've got that glued, I'm going to bring this over and I'm going to set one of these teeth that are pointing inward. It's right up against my walnut, and I'm just going to go ahead and cut that off. And that's it. We'll let this dry and we'll come back here in a little bit. And this is really all you need to make those angles. But when I see people make dovetails, they talk about having 2 sets of calipers, one so that they can set the half tails on the sides, and the other to set the full tails in the middle. But I'd rather just use one caliper, so what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna come in here. I've already went ahead and measured this. It's 3/32 of an inch. I'm gonna use a 3/32 of an inch drill bit, and I've come in 1/4 of an inch here. I'm just gonna drill these out at both locations. That way, when I set this on top of my stock, I can just set this in here and make my mark on both ends, and I'm not juggling 2 sets of calipers around. And now I'll take my caliper and I'll just widen this up a little bit. It is wider this way than it is this way, so it'll need to be widened up a little bit to make those marks. But there we go. I can say that this is now done and ready to use. I've got all my pieces cut here. The dimensions for this is all going to be on the website. There are a few things that I need to explain to you before we get started. First off, we need to make sure that all of our plywood pieces are sanded because we will be gluing some things to some pieces. You also need to make sure that both of these pieces will fit inside of the miter gauge slot. Both of these pieces must be 1 inch and 13/16 in width. That will be important for the pins so that we have the right degree. I'm using 81 degrees. I also need to point out that I am using walnut here. I'm doing that so that you can see the difference between the plywood and the hardwood. Oh, and it's also very important that these pieces are all exactly the same width. So as you cut one piece with your table saw, you're going to want to make sure that you cut the other 2 pieces with the table saw arm locked in the same position. It will make it a lot easier later on, so it's really important that these are all the exact same width. The first thing that I want to do is I'm going to take my 2 walnut pieces or hardwood pieces and I want to tape them together. So I'm going to use some double-sided tape. They do need to be flush on the ends and on the bottom. I'll use a ruler now and I want to connect one set of diagonals. When you cut this with the bandsaw, you really want to stay right next to that line. I'm going to be perfectly honest, I made the cut with the bandsaw and I was not happy with my cut. It was kind of sloppy in the middle. So what I did was added a piece of hardboard to my sled, made a cut through it. Now I have a 0 clearance cut. I know exactly where to put this so that I can get a nice diagonal across it. I'll just lay my points where I want to cut, tape it down to this. I've already added double-sided tape, and then I'll use a push block to hold it down and make my cut. Now I need to glue this to my platform that I just made. But this is a really hard thing to glue. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add some screws. I've already marked over here where I want to put them. I roughly space these in the middle. I obviously don't want to go all the way to the end or I'll blow right through that. But I found that right about there, there, and there would work really well. And these are only temporary screws because if I ever cut into this in the future, I don't want to ruin my bandsaw blade. So I'm going to go ahead and set this to be halfway the thickness of our ramps, these triangles that we made. Okay, now I've added a clamp just temporarily so that I can drill one hole in the bottom. Now I can add my glue. Now I'd like to add my top piece and glue this down, but first I want to add the fence on the bottom. So I'm going to come in here, find the center and drill a hole out. I will be using a number 8 by 1. It does need to be countersunk into the wood. A number 8 head is about 3/8, so that's what I'm using. I'm only going to go down a little bit. Take my piece of stock here, and I just need to center it on the end. At this point, I'm not worried about gluing it on. I need to center it later on, but I do need to attach it to this. So I'm going to add my glue, and then we will attach it. I'll use a couple clamps on the end, keep it from sliding. And I found if you put a clamp across the entire width, that this can help keep things from sliding around. And we'll come back when this is dried. After this dried, I went and took all the screws out, so that's done. The next thing that I need to do is I need to add a track to the bottom of my base piece that will sit flat on the bandsaw. This is the one that I started out with, but I realized it was not long enough, so I moved over to this one. This one is slightly longer, and I will have everything updated on the website. But now we need to add this piece to the end so that this can slide in the miter slot of the bandsaw. Some bandsaws don't have miter slots. If you don't have one, you can always take another piece of stock and attach it to the side and then run your jig along the side of your bandsaw. It'll take a little bit more work to hold it on, but that's what you're going to have to do if you don't have a miter slot. The edge of my bandsaw is 2 3/32 away from the edge, so I would like this to be flush to the edge. And I think I'm going to do it on this side like this. So in order for this to fit in here, I'm going to need to cut out a groove. To make this slightly easier, I'm going to stick my carriages knife right on the line. I'm going to come to this side. I'm just going to make a mark. And that's what it looks like. I just want to make sure that I don't go over too far on either side of my line. I would like this to fit nice and tight in here so that there isn't going to be any kind of play later on. This is a cross-cut operation, so you're either going to need to use a sled or a miter gauge, but I went ahead and raised this 3/8 above the top of my sled. Just go ahead and clean up a little bit of this. It's a good idea to take this over to your bandsaw and make sure that this is sticking out on the side. I almost glued it backwards, which would have been terrible, but I'm going to go ahead and glue this now. We'll give this some time to dry. We'll come back in a little while. To finish this off, we need to make sure that our fence is going to be square with the blade. I'll go ahead and turn this. I'm just going to add a little bit of glue underneath. Turn it back. And that looks perfect. I'll flip it around to the other side, and that's looking good. So I'll go ahead and let this dry. After finishing the pin part of the jig, it's really easy to make the tail part. And it really only requires 2 boards. So just like the last one, we're going to need to make a track and a piece of stock. This is 3/4 inch plywood. This cut needs to be the same width as the inside of the last one. I've got a runner here that's about a 1/2 inch and it just barely fits on the board. Doesn't have to be all the way across. But I'm going to add some glue, and then this just fits right on the bottom base jig. It's very simple. Let me go ahead and add some glue now. I'll give it about 30 minutes and we'll come back. Just like the pin jig, we're going to need to have an arm or a fence that our stock will rest against. So we'll take our fence stock and it's going to fit right here on the end. We're going to add a screw through the bottom, but we're only going to do it right here on this corner. Because my plywood is 3/4 inch thick, I will be using a flat-headed screw that's about 1 inch. This is a number 8. I'm just going to add a hole through here, and then we'll attach the block to the end. I'll make a mark this way and then this way. Now I went ahead and clamped the fence on here. You can see the hole I've drilled out on the bottom. I'll use the same 1/8 inch bit that I used to drill that hole out, and I just want to use a piece of tape as a depth gauge, so I really don't want to go through the top of it. Now I'll go ahead and just finish this hole. And now I can add my screw. Before I do that, I really want to countersink this into the wood. So I'll use one of these countersink bits to do that. And that is below the surface. It's perfect. It's what I want. Now, the reason that we added just that one screw is we want to pivot this. And again, we'll set this to 81 degrees, which is what our pins are set to. I've got a square protractor here, and I'm just going to set it to 81 degrees. Now, with that set, I can place it on my jig and then just move that fence over until it touches it. And now, once I'm sure that this is absolutely right up against that measurement, that angle, I'll go ahead and clamp this down. We'll check it again. Now with this in place, I can come in here and drill this out. And that's finished. That's all it takes to make a tail jig for this. And now you can see that I've already cut into this. Not really happy about that, but I've got an idea that will help with this problem in the future. With this fence that we added, I'm going to add a single mark. It shouldn't be very big, but you can see it's just a little mark. We'll use this later to reference our stock to. I am going to make a box, so I have 4 pieces in all to do that. I'm going to have 2 pieces that are going to be my tails and 2 pieces that are going to be my pins. So I'm going to go ahead and mark these now. Tail, pin, tail, pin. What I want to do now is I want to add a thickness to the end of each one of these boards that will tell me how far to cut down. So with my pins, I'll go ahead and add a board to the top here. I've got a board down here that's just holding it in place. And then I'll take my tails, because my tails will be matching up with my pins. I'm just going to draw a line. Now, you could use a knife to do this, but I think it's going to be a little bit easier if you see it with a pencil. I'll flip these over and do the same thing again. Now that my pins are done, I'm going to come back here and do my tails. Now I'm going to work on my tails first before I do the pins. Now you can mark each of these individually, but because we are working with a bandsaw, and bandsaws are good with stacking things, we're going to go ahead and tape these together. I'm using some light duty carpet tape. When we stack these, they have to be flush on all four sides. I will be using my quad vise to lay out my marks. You obviously don't need to have a quad vise to do this. Any kind of bench vise will work just fine, but in a little bit you'll see the advantages of having this quad vise. To make this, you're going to need to have a caliper as well as a dovetail marking jig. A lot of people that make dovetails like to have two sets of calipers because they like to be able to set their edges and then the tails in the middle. But my jig will allow you to make a mark a 1/4 inch away from the end, which will be our half tail, and then I'll bring it over here and do the same thing. With the calipers, we're going to use it to make segments in the middle. Each one of those segments are going to be the tails. So if I mark this right now, let's say I put this at the halfway mark between the two, that's going to give me 2 different pins. But with this, I'd like to do 3 pins altogether. So I'm going to lower this back and see what it takes me to make it over to this edge. And I'm not going to stick this in too far because I don't want to have permanent marks. That right there is going to give me 3. Now that alone is just going to give me the different segments. Now I need to add spaces between those segments. So I'm going to want to open this up just a little bit, which will give me those spaces between. So I'll open it right about there, and then we'll move it 1, 2, and that's going to be a little too big. So I'm going to go back a little bit and we'll do it again. That's going to be a little too small. And that's going to be, I think, just right. So I'll start on this side and I'll push my caliper in, my point, and then I'll rotate and put my point in there. And then I'm going to stop, put my point in the other hole, and then press it in this side, move over and press it on this side. That will give us 3 different tails altogether. With my marks found, I'm going to bring my marking gauge over here, and I want to start from the right side, and I'm going to pivot around. So I'm going to come to this mark here, put my pencil inside that hole that I made, and then I'm going to start on this side and draw a line. I'll come down here to the 3rd hole, so I'm going to skip that first one, and I'll draw another line. I'll come to the 5th hole, add my line, and I'm done with this side. So now I'm going to rotate around, starting with this side over here, add my pencil into that hole, and then I want to come to this side and draw a line. Now I'll come to the 3rd hole, and then I'll draw a line, come to the 5th hole, and I'll draw my last line. Now I just need to do the opposite side and take it over to the bandsaw. The first thing that we need to do before we do anything else is to make sure that our blade is at a 90 to our tabletop. If it's not at a 90, it doesn't matter if you stack these twice, if you do one at a time, it's not gonna work out. Now I'm gonna add my base as well as my tailboard. A little while ago I made this magnetic stop, and I'm going to go ahead and set this so that my jig doesn't go any farther than right about there. I do not want to cut into my jig again. So I know that no matter what I do, I can't go any farther than right about there. I'll put my stock on my jig now, and the back side of this line, it needs to be just a little bit away from the front of the base. I'll move this out of the way. You can see there's a little line right here, and I'll mark the side of my stock. So I know that as I'm working with this to keep that lined up, that'll just make it a little bit easier for me to know where everything is on here. Now when I make my cuts, I'm going to cut on the right side of the line. Just like we started on the right side with the dovetail marking jig, we're going to cut on the right side of each one of these lines. Now I'm going to flip this over and I'm going to do the exact same thing on this side. So I'll be cutting on the right side of each one of these lines. But first, let me go ahead and make that mark again. And just like that, we've done what I think is the hardest part for cutting dovetail tails. And that is just getting a straight line. At this point, we can take the jig off. You could use a coping saw to cut this out and then use a chisel to go from there. But we're gonna do a little bit more with this. With my magnetic stop, I'm gonna come in here, I'm gonna find where the tooth hits the line. And it looks like it's gonna be right about there. So now I can tighten this down and know that when I make this cut, that will be my stop so that I don't go any further and cut past that line. And there we go, I've got my tails done. I can take this back now and clean this up. I have a little bit of chiseling to do. It's not a whole lot, but we'll go ahead and take that over now. Back here at the workbench, I can go ahead and detach my pieces. Now I need to mate each of these pieces together. So what I'll do is I'll just create a box on the top of my workbench, and I'll start on this side. I'll go letter A, and then I'll go clockwise, B, C, and D. The nice thing about cutting your tails first is that even if you make a little bit of a mistake, you're using your tails as a template for the other pieces. So it's really important that we create a mate for each piece, so we can't just use it as a template. Most of my pieces here are still gonna need a little bit of work done, so we're gonna take these over to the quad vise. One of the things that I like about my quad vise is that it has a dovetail hold down right on the top. So while dovetail hold downs were used on the bench top so that you could work on the tails, I can do the same thing with this. I've got a piece of hardboard down here so that I'm not worried about cutting into the top of my vise here. And now I can just lock this down to the surface. So I just need to come in here and clean things up just a little bit. Now that I've cleaned up my tails, I'm going to go ahead and line up my letter A with the letter A side of this board. Once I get this in here, I'll go ahead and tighten this down. Now I can move this back and line this up over my pin piece, and then I'll lock my dovetail hold down into place. I'll make sure that I'm flush on the ends. Now I can come in here and use my tails as a template for the pins. I'll use a knife. I'm just going to come in here. I'm going to push up right against the side of the tail and just add these marks. I'll release my tails. Now we'll bring the pin piece up. We want to carry those lines over the end. If we're looking at the top of this, we want to cut out this piece, that piece, and that piece. But just like the tail piece, we're going to come in here, we're going to start with one, we're going to skip the next one, go the next, and do that all the way to the end. You could take the jig and use it to draw your lines, but I think it's a lot easier just to use a square. What I'll do is I'll take my knife and put it in the cut, and then I'll bring my square over here. I don't want to draw a line right here because I would be cutting more into the pin piece. So I'm going to move it back just a little bit to mark on the inside. That way I know that if I cut that line, I will be right on the edge, right where I need to be. I'll move into the third one, bring it in just enough that I can get the point right on that line. To remind myself which side of the line I'm going to cut on, I'll just go ahead and move my X's down and flip this over and do the other side. And I'll repeat the same process from before. I'll bring those X's down so I know which side to cut on. Now we're ready to take this over to the bandsaw and cut these out. When we bring this over to the pin board, we still have to be careful on which side we cut. So if I take this and move this up to the blade, you can see I've got it on the wrong side. So I need to flip this over and make sure that I'm on the right side. Now you might think, well, how do you cut the other side? We take this and we flip it over, and when we do this on the other side, we'll be able to make those cuts. Now I want to make sure that I don't cut too far into my stock, obviously. So I'm going to move it so that I get right close to that line, and then I'm going to use my magnetic stop again and line up the board to the end of my pieces here. And just like before, I can line up those lines. I want to be really careful I don't go too far. I'm gonna bring my guide down just a little bit. It'll help keep the vibrations off of the blade. I'll go ahead and make my cuts. With my first side done, I can flip this over and work on the second side. Again, cutting on the left side closest to my X. After you've made your cuts, you're going to want to hog it out. To do that, you want to make sure that your thicker part of your pins are pointed up and not down. That way, as you cut out the waste, you're not cutting into the bottom of your pins. Trust me, I know I've made the mistake already. So again, make sure that the thicker part of your pins are pointed up when you hog it out. When you've done that, you'll flip it over and notice these little tiny triangles. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna flip this over again. We're not gonna go too far over, just enough to get those triangles. Oh, and I forgot to mention that when you cut those little tiny triangles out, that it's okay to have the smaller sides up. Just be really careful when you cut those triangles and you should be good to go. As much as I love my quad vise, the last thing that I want to do is to tell you that you have to go watch that video in order to get this to work. So I took a piece of wood that I know is 90 degrees. It's 90 from here to there. It's very accurate. And I'm going to use this as a dovetail hold down to get these pins cleaned up. With all my pieces cut and complete, I can go ahead and build my box. So I've got my letter C here. It's going to line up here. I've got the letter A and D. D is going to go over here. Letter A is right there. And let's go ahead and put this together. And we look pretty square. With a little bit of glue, we can glue this in place and we should be good. Now, I won't tell you that this is the best way to make dovetails, but I will say that this is the first time I've ever made dovetails with the jig system that I've created, and it did a really good job. I have not mastered this. Again, these are the first 4 joints that I've made, but I think that it's not too bad for what I've got here. In the future, I do have some ideas on how to make this a little bit better, but if you want the plans for 5 easy payments, no. There's no charge, they're on my website, but I would like to know what you think of this design down below. If you happen to make the jigs, I'd love it if you sent me a picture showing what you did. I get a lot of joy out of seeing what other people have done and passing on some of the information that I come up with. Thank you so much for watching, and check out my Patreon link in the description as well if you'd like to help support the channel.